Okay, hello again. This is the second broadcast of the Circle Online Symposium 2014. We are at the University of Edinburgh, and I would like to welcome Daphne Dragona, who is a media curator and researcher based in Greece and Berlin, and she's going to talk to us about her ideas on the use of networks in a playful way, and she will bring examples from the project Hybrid City, which happened in Greece last year in 2013. So here is Daphne. And we also have Derek Jones of the Open University, who is currently based in Dundee, and who's going to talk to be in the discussion with us after Daphne's presentation. So here's Derek.
How are you doing, everybody? Looking forward to hearing all about networks in play. So looking forward to a good presentation this morning.
Derek, your camera is not on.
Oh, my apologies. There we go.
I turned it on now. I turned it on now. It's okay. Hello. Hi.
Awesome. How are you doing? How are you doing, everybody?
Okay. All right. Okay. So we come back to us now. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. So,
hello. Thank you, Sophia, for the invite and the introduction. I will switch immediately to my presentation so that we can look. Oops. Okay. So, yeah, what I will talk about today is part of my PhD research. And I think I should say that my research interest lies on the way architectures and algorithms of digital networks increasingly affect and regulate our everyday lives. I particularly the PDF is
yeah,
not
it's okay. No,
we have to share.
Okay. No, it's
no, we didn't.
Did you want to share it?
Yes.
Right, okay. It's not in the chat. Let me just do that. Yeah, here. Okay.
Sorry.
This is delayed a little bit. That's why.
Oh, but I think I didn't do it.
Okay. Zoom. Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So yeah, so my interest lies on the way architectures and algorithms of digital networks affect and regulates our everyday life, and I particularly focus on social media, and especially on social networking studies sites, and study how power relationships are developed within the networks and between users and the networks. And I could say that I'm especially interested in the misconceptions of that digital connectivity today creates. So yes, yeah, here's like some topologies that I will later talk about today. So I'm interested in how, let's say, topologies intersect and how protocols are somehow unclear in networks, and how algorithms at the same time work in ways that are automated and unseen. To put this in, let's say, simple words and with a simple example, for instance, users in Facebook, we could say that they realize that they are part of a network of friends that they themselves choose, but little do they realize that their likes on the newsfeed are defined by Facebook, by the Facebook EdgeRank, its algorithm that opens access to third parties. And this, of course, brings issues and questions about data, about whose data is it, and that is being exchanged. Is it like something that belongs to the data brokers, the networks, the advertising companies, or the users? And a similar kind of misconceptions can be found in network interactions taking place within the urban environment. So somehow we feel when we are in the city that we are in a way in the center of every interaction with others, and that we can get all the information that we need. But little do we realize how our metadata is kind of being used, and how our devices might be transmitting data without us understanding. Like kind of contemporary apparatuses, the web and the city gather and control an amazing wealth of data about us, which is generated by us, and it's also captured by sensor systems embedded within infrastructures. And these are like some of the main questions that I try to address, like for whom are data captured and processed? Do users, inhabitants really have access to them? Is it possible to talk about different network architectures that would respectively allow new forms of communication beyond control? Or about network infrastructures that users and citizens can own and control? And what renders opposition to the current centralized architectures and mechanisms so difficult? And this last point is especially what I will talk about. So why we can't understand what exactly is happening into the networks, or why we are being led by misconceptions within them. And I think that briefly we could say that there are three things that we have to take into consideration. The first one are the complex topologies that somehow we have to deal with, because we have to have in mind that social and informational topologies intersect, like I was saying before, like the network of friends on one hand, and then like the networks that social buttons, let's say, for instance, can connect to. And then there is an issue about this, well, I write here uncanny algorithms, this idea of human and non-human elements that meet within network environments. And yeah, here we can remember a bit what Bruno Latour was saying in his actor network theory, that it is important to ask not only who is acting, but also what is acting, and to take into consideration the uncertainty of such an action. And then the third thing is like this idea of soft control that different scholars have talked about, and Tiziana Terranova also mentions. And she particularly describes like the new diagram of power as an abstract machine of soft control, which operates by exploiting the productive capacities of the hyper-connected many. And I think that this is a text that she wrote in 2004, before the social media, but I think it's very interesting to see how this is applied in networks today. And we can just imagine that users wouldn't be really let's say, using the networks the way they do if they kind of would know how their data is being used. And so we could say that controlling networks have to be soft. Controlling network has to be soft in order to work. And for this reason, users are being given the possibility that they are in control. For instance, that we control our privacy settings. But on the other hand, there are a number of issues and factors that we cannot really control. So this is something I will refer to now quite very briefly. Just as part of my research, I try to study how power relationships can be examined, can be studied within networks. This is like let's say the kind of theory that Castells discusses in his communication power book, and he's describing like the different forms of power that can be found in the networks. Here I more focus on the two main, let's say, forms, like the network making power and the counter power. And yeah, and he specifically explains how, for instance, there is on one hand the power to constitute and program networks according to the goals, and you also have the power. You can find the ability to connect and ensure the cooperation between different networks, and this is what he talks about, like as the power of programmers and the power of the switchers. So the power to program networks and the program to connect networks and control the communication between them. And then as counterpower, he says that one should look again to these same elements and find ways of how, let's say, networks could be reprogrammed. And this could mean introducing new codes, altering the kernel of the program code or blocking the switches between the networks. And then a second quite well-known approach is this by Galloway and Tucker in their exploit book, where they discuss the protocol and the counter protocol as forms of power and resistance. And well, Galloway and Thacker more follow Deleuze and like this and Foucault and this idea of forms of free-floating control, and this idea of the distributed diagram, let's say. So for them, the protocol is not only a set of recommendations and rules, it also proposes the route of the flow for communication, and therefore it influences the network nodes. And they kind of explain that somehow counter resistance, counter protocol, as they said, can be found in asymmetry, so that this profound asymmetry that we find in the networks can be used to also kind of bring resistance. And this can exist in this idea of the exploit, which comes also from the hacker community, and it has to do with how we can locate holes, how we can locate like kind of weak points and exploit the power differentials in order to use them to bring resistance. Yeah, and then a third kind of theory that comes from political philosophy, and it's a bit different, is from Georgia Agamben, who talks about the apparatus and the counter apparatus. And now there's something very, something very interesting about his approach, because he's describing the apparatus as a mechanism which captures, orients, determines, intercepts, models, controls, or secures gestures, behaviors, opinions, or discourses, as he puts it. And I think that this is exactly what networks more or less today are doing, that they somehow manage to regulate and normalize our behavior. And then he brings this idea of the counter apparatus in, which for him can only be an act of profanation. And profanation for Agamben has to do with how we don't only abolish and erase separations, but we put in new use through profanation, and somehow we play with them. And he introduces this idea of playing as a form of profanation that somehow can change the rules, the power that can be found within a system. So having this in mind, I started realizing that somehow this is a kind of a practice or a strategy, we could say, that some artists are using in order to make networks become understood by users, by participants. This is an example that I have here by Dmitry Kleiner and the Telekommunisten collective from Berlin, who 2 years ago, within the context of Transmediale Festival, they created Octo, which was, as they call it, an intertubular pneumatic packet distribution system. And it was basically a network art project that aimed to investigate the technological network development and the social and political effects of network communication. In simple words, what they did was that they wanted to connect the different activities of the festival taking place in different rooms and spaces under, let's say, one centralized system. And the central node that was controlling everything was in the foyer of the space of HKW. And these yellow tubes were going like, were connecting the foyer with the other spaces. The interesting thing is that they somehow use this very kind of playful architecture model that they created in collaboration with Raum Labor, a group of architects from Berlin. And the way that it worked is that somehow there were hoovers connected in the central node, and from there people could send messages by using like cylinders that were traveling from one spot to the other, which also had the reference to mail art and to the pneumatic tubes used in the past. when Kleiner talked about it in Transmediale Festival, it was I found it very interesting that he especially used this expression. He said that somehow you have to invite people to play the network in order to understand it. And then I somehow tracked a kind of a similar approach in the work of Julian Oliver and Dania Vassiliev when they were invited 2 years ago to do a workshop for youngsters, and their kind of the invitation to them was to how they can do a workshop about networks that people can understand how they work. And they again introduced a kind of a model that it was an analog one, and like students had to transmit, let's say, network packets one to another by learning exactly how a network works. And a different example, very recent, from I think a university group in Germany, a project based on the privacy settings of Facebook, where they basically have built a kind of a game around it, and they invite you to understand like your privacy settings and become aware about how it all works through playing a game. Now what Sophia referred to in the beginning is like a project that I initiated last year, which was a parallel activity of the Hybrid City Conference, an international conference organized by the University of Athens in Athens. But this was a project which was commissioned, produced by Goethe Institute Athens. The idea was especially to kind of create a cluster of workshops that could expose, let's say, the mechanisms of the networks to the participants, the citizens, users in the city of Athens, and somehow make them understand how they might constitute apparatuses, let's say, of surveillance and control, but that at the same time they can become the ground for modes of emerging modes of communicating, being, and sharing beyond control. So I thought that it would be good if we could somehow look into the fundamental notions and architectures of the networks, as well as in the materiality of our devices, and to kind of open, let's say, the black box of technology and allow different kind of mechanisms to be put in action. So this was, for this initiative, I invited Julian Oliver, Dania Vassiliev, Gordon Savicic, Sabrina Bastin, and Audrey Samson to come in Athens and run 4 different workshops that I will now briefly talk about. Maybe we go to, yeah?
Sorry. To that. And now bring this. Here.
And then share again.
I want to do that. And then sharing. Turn that here. And here. Share.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks. So covert computing was the workshop that Julian Oliver ran in Athens, and it was a workshop that we could say that it aimed to tackle issues of trust in a kind of a period where objects around us have properties that sometimes we don't know, that serve purposes that remain unknown to us. And there's also this idea that about these objects that are considered weaponized now in the years of NSA. And somehow Julian thought that it would be a great idea if some of this power could be brought back to the users and learn them how they can do that. So we wanted to build a kind of a network of objects, let's say, that could communicate, like would be nodes that communicate to one another. And participants, the 15 participants that took part, were invited basically to bring objects from their home where they would hide microcomputers. So here you can see, for instance, that they brought books. They brought small boxes, like a box from tennis here, or even paintings, fake flowers, and they used these, as I said, to hide these microcomputers, the routers that they broke open, if we could say that, and they learned how to modify them and program them in order to exchange messages and files with one another. And so maybe here you can have a look. There is a Flickr page which is under the Datenspiel name, where photos can be found. Yeah, here different examples. The second workshop was a workshop run by Badania Vasiliev. It was called Netless, and it was following a project by the artist that started some years ago, and he had already built a model about it. The idea is basically how citizens can kind of build a grassroots communication network system by taking advantage of the transportation system that can be found in the city. And so ideally the nodes of this network are attached to trains or to buses, or they're carried by the citizens themselves, what we did in Athens that I will talk about. And when two nodes meet, then they can exchange messages with each other. And the idea is somehow here how to escape control, how in a period that anonymity is not anymore easy and everything is more or less locked, this can be reversed. So again, for this workshop, participants first have to learn how to basically program these routers. And then they somehow plan together with the artist how this could be tried out in the city of Athens. They also learn how to, of course, exchange messages. And they tried different, let's say, modes of walking, and tried different distances to see how the network really works. When they exchange messages, how far they can go or they cannot go. And the interesting thing is that it's a kind of a network that, in a way, it works like a virus. So once one node is connected and it gets a message from another one and another one, then somehow all messages are exchanged between nodes once they meet. So it invites people, let's say, to share information that it's important for the many and not for a few. No, it's not for private communication. A third workshop was the CPU mapping by Gordon Savicic, and Gordon more addressed like how the importance of online maps today, and like raised questions about who defines what kind of data are mapped, whose image of the city is really captured, and how would this map be if users themselves could define the layers, the categories, and the entries. So the participants first looked back in different forms of cartography, and then they basically decided to use the OpenStreetMap, and they also used, let's say, simple kind of analog ways by going out to the city and with papers and pens, noting down the things that they were interested in, and then when they got back, they could somehow insert this into the OpenStreetMap and develop it themselves. The interesting thing is that they thought of the categories. They were what was categorized and what was mapped was, of course, according to their opinion. The aesthetics that were used in the map were of course also up to the participants, and then they were also invited to use sensors, which was another very interesting aspect in a kind of period that everything is tracked and measured by sensor systems within the city environment. We don't even know how this happens. Participants here were kind of invited to decide what they would track and why. And here at these last pictures we could see the sensors. And the fourth workshop was the electromagnetic cityscape with Sabrina Basten and Audrey Sampson. This workshop more was addressing the this idea of the electromagnetic field that can be found in today's cities, and how this is somehow that we cannot really feel. So the girls invited workshop participants to bring from their homes a kind of a piece of garment that they would use, and an old electronic device. The idea here was that somehow they would create kind of wearables, and the electronic devices were kind of broken open, and they would use the components of them to hear the electromagnetic wave of the city. The interesting thing again in this workshop was that somehow not only they address this unseen and unfelt electromagnetic waves, but they also somehow address the issues about how technology imposes this idea of a constant desire for new technology, let's say. So that's the reason why they invited people to bring old devices, raising questions about how we constantly buy new products that, of course, increase the electromagnetic waves in the city. And yeah, what else that I would like to mention that it's interesting is that somehow for this workshop, Sabrina and Audrey particularly highlighted that they don't consider themselves as experts. They love what they do, and they somehow are playing around with the participants, and they impart their enthusiasm for discovery. So they want participants to work together and to have fun in order to understand how this electromagnetic field can be felt. And here you can see some kind of fun examples as well. And yeah, we walked around the neighborhood that we were at. The workshop took place at the space of From, workshop space about new media art in Athens. Yeah, if we can go back to the PowerPoint for a little bit. Just to conclude. Yeah.
PowerPoint is here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, to my eyes, like the workshops were successful and important for, if I could name, like the following reasons. The first one was that they, I think, succeeded in opposing this idea of the black boxing of today's network systems and technologies. So participants really engaged with the materiality of their devices, the systems and their components. And like by breaking things open, by repurposing them and modifying them, they really got to know and become confident about what they had at hand. Then the second thing was that somehow they could own what they had in their hands, and it was a kind of also an approach of an inclusive rather than exclusive sense of ownership. Third point was that somehow all workshops turned back to the human element, the need to somehow address the users behind in order to have these networks working. And another point which was important, that they were of course based on free and open source software, and they kind of embraced this playfulness in order to make network systems understood. I think that somehow this way that the artists are working today, exposing networks and inviting people to use them on their own and create perhaps their own network systems in the future, has to do a bit with this idea of Rancière about emancipation, and about somehow the person that teaches the knowledge, that passes this knowledge, basically focuses on the capacities that users, participants anyway might have, and they don't present some different kind of power or intelligence, or they don't want to create some kind of dependency. There's a kind of a rhizomatic approach where a group works together and builds on knowledge that they can share and will use in the future. Yeah, and to conclude, I think it was basically an attempt to invite people to learn and build networks, and somehow to use this technology in the future, and by inviting others to join them in this initiative. And I have here like a nice quote by Michael de Lange, who underlines kind of this, that we must shift attention from technologies that seamlessly blend in with everyday life towards technologies that move people and enable them to move others. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Daphne. Let's put this out of here. Yeah, and now maybe we'll get Derek with us. Sorry. Oops. And
How are you doing? Do you want to turn video on, or?
Can we have your camera as well, please?
Yeah, no problem at all. That was really, really interesting, Daphne.
Derek, we don't. Yeah, no, yes. Now we have your camera. Fantastic. Yes.
Cool. Excellent.
Okay.
That was really, really genuinely interesting, Daphne. Could I maybe go back to, I mean, some of the stuff you were introducing at the start was particularly interesting. You introduced the network as quite a complex topology that comprises sort of social, technical, economic, political sort of factors. The other thing, it really reminded me, one of the diagrams, particularly when you were describing sort of basic topological architectures, or mathematical architectures, if you like, of networks, it really reminded me of Christopher Alexander, 1965 paper, where he talks about the city not being a tree, how it's more of a scale-free topology that emerges, if you like. And I wonder whether, because of all those relationships, you know, the complex overlaying of networks, I wonder how much of an access do you think we might have to digital networks, because we're barely aware of sometimes the social networks that we exist in. We're barely aware of the political, the economic networks, all of these things. You know, can people, I mean, through this notion of play, can people really get access to those networks? Can they really understand them almost from a position of not looking down on them, but, you know, understanding their position within a network? Or is the play quite a superficial thing that only touches on the network?
I think that's the challenge. I believe that most people don't understand to which extent they are being ruled by networks without really understanding their structures. The question is how this can change. And I think especially social networking sites, because it's like they're used for communication, are somehow like the best example for that, because people really think that they somehow have the knowledge, they have the capacity, and they know how everything works. But the question is how to change that, or at least make people, and we're not saying that we should abandon these networks necessarily, but we should know how they're working. And I think what is important in the work of artists is that somehow they bring in this this affective, let's say, element.
Yep.
That's why I like Rancière a lot, that he talks about this idea of the sensus communis, like how you kind of share and understand like this affective part without somehow building a lesson out of it or writing a manual, but being there and inviting people to understand how a system works. And the truth is, as I can say from my experience, that people are very excited when they really understand the architectures of the networks, and they get even more excited when they see that they can somehow build something on their own, and that could be autonomous, and that they can control, and that this is what control is about. Control is not just about selecting what you can do within an environment that it's being given by a company.
But do you think then that, you know, with that that sort of play with one particular type of network, for example, a digital network, do you think that people then really sort of take on board that learning, and actually, it's almost as if, do they actually put themselves within that network and realize that they're not just playing with a thing, but that that thing represents themselves in some way, or that's their representation of themselves? Do they actually see themselves as embodied in the network? Or is it really just is it a superficial thing where people don't maybe take power back from it, but just say that's interesting, but they don't maybe internalize maybe some more subtle message that they realize or don't realize that they are part of a larger structure, or how that structure might even affect them?
Well, yeah, I think yes and no. From one perspective, I think that people more and more understand that it's about the real identities that they're playing with, that somehow we have given up of this idea of how we could kind of build different identities within networks, because we're more or less participating with our real data, and we want to promote our real selves.
Okay.
Yeah, present ideal kind of presentations of who we really are. But on the other hand, I don't know if they understand how far a network goes. I think they only see a small network of people they communicate with. Well,
is that then in itself, is that a structural problem with almost looking at this as if it were a network, that as soon as you say network, you immediately imply the node and then the connections of those nodes, and by doing that you almost kind of create this duality? And I wonder whether, you know, almost my person, I mean, I've just connected with you on Twitter, for example, Daphne. But I mean, part of my personality is the extension of my network itself. Is there a way of looking at almost individual nodes of the network, me as an individual or you as an individual, that they are actually also a whole range of connections, and that whole thing is actually almost a little tiny sub-network, that you're not just a node, you go beyond this. So is this notion of embodying, I suppose, an idea of something that's beyond just a discrete element within that network, that we can't exist without all of these other social connections about which we are sometimes very, you know, we are very unaware of, if that makes sense. Does that make any sort of sense at all? I suppose the question would be, is there a problem with a network model? Because the network model tends to be quite a traditional model. You mentioned rhizomatic very briefly. So, for example, you know, looking at Deleuze, for example, I mean, is there a way of looking at the network as something of a shift between sort of node and network compared to something that's a bit more interactive or rhizomatic, dare I say?
If you mean from, if we can see it as a positive think from this perspective, or how?
I suppose it's maybe how we visualize the network, that as soon as we sort of think in terms of nodes and then relationships, we don't put those two things together. So I might think of myself as a node, when in actual fact I'm perhaps much more than that. I'm more of a mini network myself. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, of course. But because it's all increasingly complex.
Yes, absolutely.
It's all increasingly complex, and it's very difficult for, I think, anybody to kind of comprehend, to get the whole picture of how the whole thing works around you as yourself as a node. And even if you will get the first layer, which is like which networks are you in, whom you're connected with, blah, 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 and how it all looks distributed, not really. Then you will not understand anyway, how no matter how you try, you will never know how the other layers are being functioning and how they're being used. That have to do with the like more the metadata of your real self. And this is a difficult thing. How do you know, how these elements control your life and regulate your life without you really understanding it?
Okay. I wonder then, would there be another approach to this? I mean, what was interesting was some of the images that you showed where, I'm going to call it sort of semi-technical images. They weren't necessarily relying on the technology. For example, I can't remember the chap's name who was sort of drawing over the top of images of the city. I wonder, is there another way of learning about networks, whether it's to do with relationships in the city or relationships between people? Is there a way to do it using existing analogies, such as Christopher Alexander's analogy of the city as a scale-free topology, of learning about networks by learning about non-technological networks in the first instance?
I think definitely. Yeah. And the more, I don't know, physical a network can get, or
completely agree.
Yeah, the more clear it becomes for us. Have something, that we can have in our hands, or that we can really comprehend because we know the image of it. So I totally believe that.
Okay.
And I think that for people it's much easier, as far as I have seen it working.
Okay then.
And reading about it and listening to stuff and lectures about networks.
Sure. How about then a wee ethical question then? I mean, at the Open University, we have, we need to establish and develop sort of social networks to allow our students to connect, to allow students and tutors to connect, and so on and so forth. And we have a range of different tools, and we see exactly what you've been describing. That we see sort of different types and topologies of network arising and connections between students, and we almost kind of try to disrupt these, because it's very easy to see the normal sort of power networks arising, whether it's really popular student work on a virtual studio, or whether it's a student that communicates more than a student that doesn't communicate as much. You see these networks reinforcing themselves, and we put a lot of effort into trying to disrupt these networks, to try to allow serendipity to occur, to allow people to discover different types of network, or even introduce themselves into the network. Ethically, as a network maker or designer, I mean, what are the sort of ethical responsibilities, do you think, of a network creator or somebody allowing a network to emerge?
Difficult one. I think that you should not become the central node. Let's start from that.
Yep, absolutely. But definitely, that'll do. That's good.
Allow people to, I don't know, communicate in a form of a distributed network, kind of a peer-to-peer network, like one-to-one, like that any node can communicate with any node. Try to somehow use this topology, or maybe use both, so that they can understand what the advantages and disadvantages of each architecture.
Can I just add something here, which also has to do with this project that we are doing now? Because yesterday, Derek, we were discussing with Daphne in the afternoon how this project went, that I wanted to have, these networks interacting and then observing the parallel activities and all of this. And then we sort of agreed that it needed to be a little bit more directed at times and in various ways in order for this to become more efficient, to kind of come up with something. And in relation to this topic here of how to not be the center of the network, I think it's maybe a case in which one can think of the different degrees of one thing and the other, how much is not going to be in the center of the network, but also how much he's going to somehow direct things, isn't it? In order for something to happen and things to not just kind of evaporate or collapse. And I think that balance is very interesting and very challenging.
Yeah, well, the question is how to motivate people also to use the network. That's that's what we were discussing also.
Yeah.
And when a lot of difficulties pop up about motivation, then all of a sudden you realize that you have to kind of become a central node in order to make things happen. So yeah, kind of distributed topology for such a system means that somehow students, I guess, should be motivated to really collaborate with one another.
I suppose
rather than having to, I don't know, to do something that they deliver for one person, but somehow that they have to kind of exchange knowledge or build knowledge together. Because these kind of networks are very vulnerable. If you don't have the people there sharing and giving info, then they're not there anymore. That's the difficult thing.
I suppose that goes back to the sort of first point, that a network is not simply a function of its technical characteristics. So, for example, we might provide a network that allows completely seamless peer-to-peer networking, that has a complete flattening of the hierarchy between, say, a tutor and a student, that has no differentiation between those sorts of nodes in the network. But what you will see then emerging is that the network will then build itself usually along either social lines or maybe lines of political agency, whether a student maybe feels that they have agency in a digital environment or is confident in a digital environment, or whether they're confident in a social environment or not confident. You see all those other things, the social, the political, the economic, the technical. The technical is almost a side issue in some way. So I suppose the question might be, ethically or even logistically, can we and should we manipulate, just as you've been talking about, digital networks to encourage what you might dream of as a perfect network? And then if you do so, are you not just recreating, maybe a better problem, but the same problem? Or is this too early in the morning for these sorts of questions?
Well, I guess the question, the answer to that would be, we have always to think for whom is this happening? Whom does this serve? And if somehow it comes back to the person for whom you're doing this, then it might be okay.
But then I'm sure that Facebook think of that every day.
Sorry?
They'll be thinking, who does this serve every day?
Derek, we couldn't hear. Say again, what is the Facebook?
Facebook, they'll be thinking exactly the same thing. They'll be saying, who does this serve?
But they're making a lot of profit.
That's what I mean.
That's the difference.
Yeah.
I'm afraid.
Yeah, I mean that again is a complex. Is a complex issue in the sense of, again, if we take the example of this symposium, this sort of idea that I thought I want to compare those things and make those things and activate those networks and all that. I'm not the Facebook, and I'm not making any money out of this, but I'm making some research for myself. Or something which can be very useful to other people, and I think it has been. I think, for example, I don't know if you had the chance to watch the DARE group yesterday, Derek?
I haven't caught up with that one yet. No, not yet.
Yeah. Well, it was just a conversation of this group of the monthly conversation, and we sort of said what kind of research interests we share, but also discussed how we can use the wiki to communicate. I think this project of the symposium has been quite key to this group, to the disability research group, that's the name, because it kind of started a couple of months before the process of the symposium, and with the kind of the pressure of let's get this and get that, it kind of, the activity and the way people communicated and all of this, it got accelerated. So I don't feel guilty about this particular instance because I think it has led to something objectively, interesting. Because Daphne and Penny yesterday, they came to the meeting and they said, "Oh wow, this group, it's an interesting group," and it's not like that wouldn't have happened because it's the people who are there and the things that they do. But I think this pressure for this project gave some form of structure for certain things to happen amongst the group. And I think the members of the group will agree with this.
Yeah.
But it's always very sensitive, all this bit of how to agree, how to make people understand what we are trying to do and get their genuine approval rather than tell them one thing because we try to do something else, and sometimes it's even difficult to articulate this. So it's not like on purpose that somebody might, but it might be really difficult to explain what I'm trying to do and for which reason and all that.
Yeah, but somehow you shouldn't feel at all like you are somehow, how to say, making this for yourself, or like, because this is not really happening. You're part of this group, for instance.
Yeah.
And yesterday you were all discussing as one group. So the network, to my eyes, like, was totally horizontal. There was nobody saying what we do. The only thing that you asked them was like, could I record this? Because this can lead us somewhere else. And of course, different people that are nodes of a network can propose stuff and encourage a network to work. Yeah, I don't see this at all. I just see you as let's say a node of a network that proposes an activity and try to merge different networks together. But you never saw yourself as a center, I think. You're just a facilitator more.
Okay. George was saying he never thought he speaks so much when he watched the video. But I just want to ask Derek in relation to the Open University, which is a different thing that I don't have experience of that, and I don't think Daphne has. Like to sort of have this sort of regular job, like. My job as an academic is to teach students to make sure, that certain things are accessed, learned, processed, they produce the work and all of this. And of course, in the way I function, which is not online, is in this traditional way of meeting the students in the classroom and in my office, and I speak to them and all of that, I have a certain type of problems to deal with, whereas you have to function in this environment, isn't it? And of course, this is your daily job. Like you just do this constantly, and it's not like a project. I'm doing now this symposium. It just has to continue. There's no break. There's no, this is it. What you are doing. So I just want to sort of see how you feel, because from the outside, it seems to me like a huge thing. But I did hear very positive things. For example, Denita, last night we met Penny's PhD student who had passed her PhD in the afternoon, and Denita works, I can't remember now the name, he works with an organization who they deliver art and design courses online, and it's related to the University of Hertfordshire. And I said, how to find this? And she said, oh, it's amazing. It's a fantastic job. I love it. And I didn't have time to discuss with Denita, you know, why she loves all of this. So maybe, Derek, you can tell us the kind of good and bad things of that way of working in education, how you experience it.
Well, yes, I mean, as you say, it is a completely different model. I mean, we are a distance education institution, so we are remote from our students. We're not physically proximate with them, and that's been the case since about 1970. So, I mean, since then, I mean, I think this is maybe why I was kind of, I suppose, maybe very interested in the sort of relationship between social and political networks and then digital networks, because I think from the very earliest days, we developed, I think, maybe sort of social and personal networks very well with the Open University, and developed a model of allowing students to learn at a distance that was quite unique, I think, and it's a mix of convincing students that they have agency, that part of, you know, education is them taking responsibility for learning just as much as it is for us taking responsibility for providing good teaching material. I'm a big fan of Donald Schoen and active learning sort of methods, and as Donald Schoen would say, when he quotes Quist, the architectural studio lecturer, what our responsibility is to allow students to have the right sorts of experiences so that they can learn for themselves. So there's this constant energy to try to allow students to develop that agency, that horizontality, if you like, Daphne, in some ways, that we're kind of almost educating or hoping to educate students to become sort of their own little mini networks or their own little nodes in a network. And a challenge for us has then been to translate that, or to take the best of what the web offers, what digital connectivity offers, and to make sure that those two things go together. And I think that's a challenge that we're slowly coming to sort of terms with. So we spend a lot of time trying to encourage students to try things. I loved your phrase, by the way, Daphne, that notion of play the network. Particularly on the module that I am chair of, is actually a level 1 design module. And you know, my first instinct was you cannot teach design at a distance, but it turns out you can. In fact, you can actually do it more effectively in some ways, because you're putting so much more emphasis onto the design student to learn, not to teach, not to stand there and say, here's a design, you know, that's a good thing, yep, go and make one of those. That's not what it's about. It's about taking active control of your own learning, your own networks, and trying to put all that together. I really like that idea of play the network. I think that's one of the things that we are sort of desperately trying to do just now, is try to put that into practice and try to get students to say, look, this digital technology, that's brilliant. By the way, it's only really been around for about the past sort of 15 years, maybe 20 years mainstream. Your brain hasn't changed for 50,000 years. You still want to create the social connections, the psychological connections. So it's getting those two things together, those analogies between physical, sort of social and psychological, and putting them together with the digital. And that's why I think that, you know, things like the Pipes project, representing physical connections, can really make a difference to people. When they actually touch it, it becomes physical. And I realise I'm waffling just now. There's a whole load more to it than that, Sophia. But I think that's probably the crux of where we're at just now in terms of digital.
Okay. Can I ask one other question? It could be relevant. Then you tell me, Derek. If that's another question, because I'm aware of the patterns project that you are doing with Alison, and I'm just wondering, it might be something that doesn't connect to this discussion, but maybe it connects. I don't know. So the question is, do you think that this understanding of the kind of emergence of patterns and how these work is something that relates to the use of networks and to a more efficient way of understanding them, using them? Yeah, that's the question.
Yes, absolutely. And this is kind of off the top of my head, but I would actually say that using a pattern language or storytelling, or, you know, the sort of recipe stuff that we developed in the Spires network before the sort of pattern network, I think that they are actually extremely powerful metaphorical devices to allow people to actually explore all the complex issues around networks, okay? So, for example, if you're trying to, I don't know, maybe deal with a particular issue, say, for example, a ward in a hospital where you have power networks, political networks, economic networks, digital networks, all that kind of stuff. But you simplify it and you say, let's look at the metaphor, or let's look at the objective, as you both talked about, that you have this notion of an aim. And you say, what we're trying to do is make things better for this particular activity or this particular patient. And then you start to talk about these things. You actually use either the pattern or the metaphor or the recipe or whatever it is. Then things start to emerge. And then that's when you actually see all the different types of network that start to overlay the sort of complexity of that situation. There is no easy answer to this. This is the sort of complex halfway house between people and things, and as soon as you get people and things, you're into that horrible complex territory. And the only way to draw it out, I personally think, is just through discussion, is through the emergence of those kinds of things. So what would be really interesting would be then to see, well, if we have a pattern emerging here, then how does that either represent a network in itself or connects to other networks? It might be a really beautiful way to sort of put it in a position, or put it in a context, or maybe for it to describe its own context. So I think there's a lot to maybe have a think about and have a discussion about. That's the thing about networks. You can connect anything with anything. It's brilliant.
Okay, all right. I think maybe we can finish now. Yes. Okay. Unless there is anything else to add, I think we have covered that. Maybe we can continue with the patterns later in the year, once that group sort of starts working. Okay. So I'd like to thank Derek and Daphne for the presentations and conversations. Really, and yes, goodbye, everybody. Goodbye.
Ciao.
Ciao. Oh, bye. Okay, bye.